Cool. So welcome. This breakout talk is mostly going to be about feature policy, document policy, permissions policy, and the differences between them, how to know which is best for new features, and a little bit of history to sort of understand how we got here. So feature policy started out back in 2016 as an idea about how to change the web by allowing document authors to restrict the use of powerful, harmful, or undesirable features on their pages. A way to shrink the web platform down to a manageable size, and to provide a path for growing the platform responsibly. Let me see, why am I not switching slides here? Oh, there we go. I promise that's my only Pokemon joke in here. So we shipped it the following year in Chrome 60. There we go. I assume that somebody else is admitting people, so that's great. Yeah, so we shipped it in Chrome 60 as a way to allow access to exactly 2 features in iframes. It had an HTTP header and an iframe attribute, either of which could be used to grant or deny access to these features. By 2018, we had over 20 features integrated, all of them falling very strongly into the permissions and powerful features bucket. But by then, we were sort of looking ahead to other things that we could do with this tool. We proposed some additions to the spec that would allow features that focus on performance, what was going to become Core Web Vitals. We introduced non-Boolean features. We gave them thresholds, and we let developers set parameters on them. We extended the model to cover all the existing sandboxing features. We proposed different kinds of inheritance mechanisms. And all of this made the spec, the syntax, and the implementation much more complex. So last year, working in conjunction with Mozilla, we proposed to split the spec. The idea being that one side is going to be focused on delegation of permissions and powerful features. The other side having the ability to handle all of these new things. So that's where we are today. Feature policy, now permissions policy, controls delegation. And document policy is about configuration of documents, setting thresholds. And obviously, anytime that you have a split like that, it's the boundary between the two where things are interesting. Right? How do the two sides differ? How do you decide where a new feature should be? So we'll take a quick look at permissions policy. Right, this is essentially a rename of feature policy with just a couple of differences that are rolling out in Chrome M88. We've introduced a new header. We've adopted structures headers for its syntax. You can see down here how the old CSP-inspired syntax translates to the new syntax. And we've tweaked the behavior slightly in the name of security. So now with permissions policy, and actually with feature policy as well, we're supporting both headers for at least a little while until we can drive down usage. So now you need to use the allow attribute explicitly in order to delegate powerful features to cross-origin frames. And if you use the header, then what you're doing is you're naming a list of origins that could get that feature, and you actually can't add any new ones in markup, which protects against some cross-site scripting bugs. So fundamentally, it's best to think about permissions policy as a delegation mechanism. It fits the permissions model really well. And it's also really easily extended to other sort of powerful features, right? So the kinds of APIs that we want to make available to top-level pages, but we want to restrict in cross-origin embeds, like ads. So right, permission policy allows developers to delegate those features to trusted frames, and everything else is just safe by default. So now, document policy, was shipped in M86, works differently. For one, the effects of the header are generally scoped to just a single document. Not every document just gets to set its own configuration independently. And second, the features are not just Boolean toggles. I mean, they can be, but we've also introduced floats and enums, and developers can set thresholds to get enforced on their pages. Now, there is also a negotiation mechanism defined that hasn't shipped yet. It's still experimental. That would allow you to require a specific policy in a frame. In this case, you can use an iframe attribute to specify the minimum required policy, and that goes out in the sec required document policy header. Right, we normalize this, and then we just reflect it in that outgoing header. And then the browser checks the incoming policy on the response to decide whether or not to allow that page to load. Right, so it's very much like CSP embedded, if you're familiar with that. And this allows us to define features that might affect control flow in frames. We can introduce those safely to the platform. So unlike permissions policy, you can think of document policy as fundamentally a configuration mechanism. It's good for defining opt-in and opt-out mechanism for certain APIs or behavior. In the case where it's not necessarily critical that subframes be restricted in the same way. It's good for letting developers set performance thresholds. And we're hoping to be able to use this as a means to deprecate features on the web, right? By giving developers these kinds of knobs and toggles, the idea is that we can eventually move to a world where features are limited by default and have to be turned back on explicitly. And hopefully that's going to allow us to identify the places where those old APIs are still used and maybe target fixes for those use cases so they can move off of them before the API just gets completely removed. Yeah, so as a way to compare them side by side, right? Permissions policy about delegation, document policy about configuration. Permissions policy is strictly Boolean, right? And has the feature that once you disable something, you don't ever get to re-enable it any deeper. Whereas document policy is, allows you to have numbers, allows you to use enums, and gives you independent control in frames. Feature policy also means that you get to disable it in the frame unilaterally. You don't have to get the frame's agreement that you're turning off full screen. Right? All these things are permission-based, and they're generally all features that that the user could have denied permission anyway. Document policy, because of its negotiation mechanism, is a way to also introduce configuration of things that might fundamentally change the way that a frame works. And we believe this to be safe because the frame has to agree to have this done. So if you're looking at a feature and you're still sort of sitting on the fence and trying to figure out where it goes, right, those are the sort of questions that you want to ask. Right, is this considered a powerful feature? Is this something that you think that the top level document should have, but maybe you want to be careful about subframes? And if so, it's very likely going to be a permissions policy thing. If it's a matter of delegating capabilities that you have to trusted frames, then it's almost certainly permissions policy. Right, we look at whether or not disabling something in existing content might actually be unsafe. Right, if you want to disable certain kinds of scripting APIs, if you want to disabling document.domain, for instance, or disabling synchronous scripts. Those are all things that you could do, but they might change the way that embedded content works. And if so, then document policy is probably a much better fit for it. And finally, yeah, should embedded frames be able to set their own policy independent of their parent? Right, you certainly can't do this with permission-based features. If you have turned off geolocation in your frame, then your children probably shouldn't be allowed to just turn it on back on their own. On the other hand, image optimizations are totally a frame-by-frame thing, right? One frame can turn them off, the next frame can turn them back on, whatever's best for them. And for that sort of thing, document policies just make sense. Oh, and that is actually the end of the slides. So if you do have questions about this afterwards, obviously, there's my email address. Our team obviously has another email address as well to get a hold of all of us. And I've got links in here if you actually get to the slides for the specs and explainers for each of these, as well as integration guides for how to deal with this as a spec author and how to deal with this as a Chromium engineer. But I'm absolutely happy to answer any and all questions about these.
I've got one. Tell me about the relationship between permissions policy and permissions API.
Ah. So that relationship is still evolving. Permissions API is obviously older and includes things like how does a website query whether or not it has permission for something, and how does it actually request permission for that thing. Now, I believe that every feature in the permissions API should have a corresponding permissions policy feature attached to that.
I believe that is not currently true.
Not okay. We should approach that.
Okay.
Right. We should be getting there, and I think that is an actual goal that's written down somewhere. It is an open question as to whether the reverse should be true. Right? Should everything in permissions policy be represented in the permissions API? And I think that there is support for a lot of that, but not necessarily everything. I'm trying to think. So yeah, eventually we might get to a place where permissions policy is actually subsumed into the permissions API and becomes a standard mechanism for doing everything in there. The issue with that is that there's a number of features like, say, idle detection, or we want to do focus without user interaction, things that maybe don't make sense as a user-controlled permission that would have to fall under the permissions API to make that make sense.
I think this also does impact spec integration. Like a lot of the specs I've been reviewing call out to both permissions API hooks and permissions policy allowed to use algorithms. Which feels a little annoying.
Right. Do you think there'd be a way to merge those and have just a single callout to say, this is a permission, and then you're done?
Hopefully, but I haven't looked at it too hard.
Right. The other class that doesn't necessarily make sense with the current permissions API is sort of the chooser-based APIs, right? Things like WebUSB, where you don't necessarily need global permission to use this or to ask the user for that. You present them the chooser, and if they hit cancel, well, then they just denied it.
But it does fit with permissions policy because you want to be able to say iframes, no choosers for you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cross-origin frames, you don't even get to launch that.
I've got a question.
I think just one, sorry, Mason, I just want to add one thing, which is worth considering, just since we're talking about, like, because we have this question about the feature policy JS API, like, do we still need it or not, right? Mm-hmm. And so the one use case, I don't know if we mentioned, is maybe a web page doesn't want to know whether they've been granted the permission. They just want to know if it could be. And so then they might show different UI, right? That would lead a user down that path. Whereas if they know it's going to be turned off entirely, they don't want to show that, right? Show that UI. So that's something that doesn't clearly fit, I think, under the permissions API yet. So I don't know what the answer is there.
Yeah, there's sort of a fourth state of, you've never been asked, you've never been queried, you've never actually denied it, but you still can't get it anyway. Sorry, Mason, though, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little about the status of these two APIs in other implementations.
Yeah, so document policy is the easiest one because it is Chrome only right now, or sorry, Chromium only. I am not actually sure what the status is in Edge or other Chromium-based browsers. Permissions policy, so permissions policy has two sides, right? One is the header, which was previously called feature policy and is now permissions policy. And the other is the iframe allow attribute. So the allow attribute is supported in Chromium, it is supported in Safari, and it is supported in Firefox. Now, the set of features that are controlled are different in each browser. I think I actually have to go back and update the sort of feature registry to show what the level of browser support is. But the underlying allow attribute, the syntax for that, and the fact that you can control things in third-party frames is supported cross-browser.
Great, thanks a lot.
Cool.
What was the feature policy usage like out in the real world, and does that complicate the deprecation story there? Is this transition complete?
It absolutely does complicate that. So the usage of feature policy globally in the real world is something around 10% of sites using it in one way or another. Now, the vast majority of those are using the allow attribute. We see a lot of embeds, right? Things like YouTube embeds, Vimeo embeds that say iframe source equals whatever, allow autoplay, allow full screen, that sort of thing. So because of that, the allow attribute is not changing at all. We're not changing its syntax. We're not changing its name as part of the rename between feature and permissions policy. The header has much, much lower usage. I think it's something like 0.5%, but I have to go back to UMA to find that out. So, which is still not negligible, right? It's not a trivial deprecation. So in that case, what we are doing is supporting both the feature policy header and the permissions policy header at the same time, with the permissions policy header taking precedence if you've named the same feature in both. It's a much simpler case though, because it's also not supported in Firefox or Safari. So anybody who's trying to do anything cross-browser is likely already just using the allow attribute until they come up with support for that. And we're really hoping that both of those, if they do come up with support for the header, are now just going to be implementing the permissions policy header.
Is there any data anywhere about what features people are actually toggling with that?
We do have data. I don't think that it's exposed anywhere. Like it's just Google internal right now. I can see about getting that up. So I know firsthand from looking at it that autoplay is by far the largest. After that, we have at probably about 20% level use of camera, microphone, full screen, sync XHR, and geolocation, I think. And then there's a number of other features that have much lower usage, of sort of a third tier after that. Sync XHR is actually a problematic case because we really do want to move that from feature policy to, sorry, from permissions policy rather, to document policy. It makes much more sense there, but there is enough usage of it that is going to be a little bit difficult.
Do you really think we're going to be able to use this to deprecate things? Deprecating things is hard.
I really hope so. It absolutely is hard. I think that we can definitely get to the last state before deprecation, where these things are turned off by default, and you have to go through a deliberate step to turn them back on for your page. We want to do that with document domain, I think, as a trial. Yeah, and I know that Arthur Jantz and Mike West have identified like at least a dozen other APIs that we'd really like to do the same thing with. And the hope is that at that point, right, we can start driving usage down to a place where eventually we just say, you know what, we're turning it off. Right? You've all had 5 years to figure out a better way to do this. We've been telling you how to do it.
Kind of like reverse origin trials, but a little more standardized.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, reverse origin trials are great for situations where something was Chrome only in the first place, or rather, deprecation trials. Sorry, Jason. But yeah, something which is cross-browser. We're going to need a cross-browser solution to to deprecate it.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that point, like, will it be hard, super hard? Yeah, I would imagine so. It's something that's been part of the vision, I guess, for feature policy since it started. And one of the things we talk about, at least if you have people declaring via whatever policy that they do or don't use a feature, then you at least like as a browser, and we can also start like tying incentives to things, right? Like, okay, not unlike with TLS and new powerful features, you can imagine you can use whiz bang feature A, but you have to make sure you're not using old feature B, right? So at least having the ability for websites to signal what they are and aren't using, you know, is a step down that path.
Mhm. Let's see. Oh, there are also a couple extra slides, just because we do have a couple extra minutes. A couple of appendices. So if you are actually a Chromium engineer and you want to use these, there is a feature policy and document policy. Sorry, it's still called feature policy. We're gonna have to rename that soon. JSON 5 files that define all these features. So the idea is that all you do is specify the name of your feature. We give it a symbolic identifier, and you say what the default is, and then all of the code is generated for you. So that at that point, you can just start calling execution context dot is feature enabled, and pass it to Mojoenum for your feature. And it will do all the checks for you. It'll enable it in the JS API. It will enable recognizing it in the header and the parsers. And it should just be that simple. Oh, because of the existence of the reporting API, you can also decide whether any particular instance of checking is feature enabled is something that should be reported on if it fails, versus just sort of being a probing of the current state of the system. And if you say yes, then anybody who has set up reporting will, well, everybody will get a console warning saying that the check failed. And if reporting is set up, then a violation report will be sent out to reporting observers for any registered reporting endpoints. And with document policy, you do exactly the same thing. But if it's not a Boolean feature, you can say, well, what is the threshold to test this against? So for example, we have a image optimization feature that checks how many bits per pixel you're allowed to use on your images. So what we do is we calculate the bits per pixel on an image, and we say, is this feature enabled, if that's the threshold? And then if it exceeds that, then the image gets blocked, and optionally the report gets sent. And there's also a slide in here. If you are not a Chromium engineer, but you are a related spec author, then the idea is that you can integrate by referencing either the feature or permissions or document policy spec. For permissions policy, you define a policy control feature and you hook into HTML's allowed to use algorithm. For document policy, you define it as a configuration point, and you, whenever you need to use it, you get the value of that configuration point in the document. And then you can test whether or not it's stricter than your threshold. And that is the actual last slide. Are you suggesting that we merge these two things back together?
No, I'm just suggesting that people don't have to be either Chromium developers or spec
Yes.
authors. But
Yes,
yeah.
there are a number of people who are in the situation of having to do both.
I was taking notes on both slides. Thank you.
Cool. I think with that, we're about out of time now. So if there are no other questions, then I will stop the recording and let people get on with the rest of their BlinkOn. Yoav, I can't tell if you're waiting to ask a question or you're waiting for me to stop recording first.
No, I'm just, I want to say thank you and hop on a meeting. So yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone.